So I've come to the Textile Exchange, the Organic Cotton Roundtable, with the topic for this morning, business as if people mattered. And that's a reference to Schumacher and to an economics that's got a little twist compared to the current economic model. It's an economics where the sole goal is not just the short-term maximization of profit. And I think this is a moment where we are about to see another industrial revolution happening. And we are at a crossroads between the old Fordist model of mass production, which displaced local farmers, which took their expertise and put it into the big machines, and meant that only people who could afford those big machines could produce and share in the revenues of production. We're at a moment where that model is starting to crumble and give way to something that's not the city of Henry Ford model of mass production, but the city of Facebook, the city of the algorithm, where you're going to be seeing a new wave of concentration driven by advances in technology, where production and sharing in the profits of production looks like it's going to be concentrated into the hands of very few. And there's all sorts of benefits, of course, that these technologies could bring, but there's all sorts of problems that they could bring. There is another model which the range of people from all over the world who are concentrated here today are focused on, which is seeing if you can use tech, but directed towards a different goal, which is with a human focus, with a focus also on an ecosystem that works, that's based, I think, above all, not on the gigantist dream that there are going to be 3 or 4 platforms that just control the economy, and the rest of us try to cling on to some fragment of an economic function serving that platform, but instead moving with the devolution down to the margin, moving with the flow towards the small, towards the decentralized, towards the distributed. And it's the revolutions in tech and manufacturing that now make it possible for people to be making their own energy, to be making their own power, to be sharing with their own fruits of their products with long-tail markets that are distributed all over the world. Suddenly what you're seeing is there's a chance for the ownership of the means of production, rather than being radically concentrated, to being radically distributed. Whereas in Ford's era, it's been concentrated in the hands of a relatively small clique of the owners of industry, the captains of industry. Now it's going up to the platforms, but it could potentially go down to the millions all around the world, including those who've been least advantaged. So this quote from Kentaro Toyama, the Microsoft research director, that technology is not the answer, it's the amplifier of intent. The crucial thing for me is intent. What do we want to do? Do we want to use tech to create the gated community, to create the, quote, smart city that's essentially a walled city, censored and censored, with an S and a C, where we are keeping out the masses? Or do we want to use tech to turn into the wave and address the problems that the many are solving? And that's a question of intent. And that question of intent, behind it there's a philosophical question, which is, what do we value? Do we value just wealth, or do we value life? That's Ruskin's question. And then you could argue that underneath that philosophical question, there's experience. And if I really want to anesthetize your viewers here, let me quote, Levinas, the philosopher, who says what really gives us intent? He says it's actually the face of the other. That when we experience directly the face of the other, we're just seized. He called it the ought, O-U-G-H-T. It just gets us. And what worries me is we're at this extraordinary moment where what we're doing is we're trying to block out the face of the other. We're turning to our screens. We're putting up walls. We're relegating people to ghettos. We're saying to people, it's not just that we're going to turn our back on your specific problems. We don't even want to find out what they are. Part of what gives me optimism, because in the end I am optimistic about this stuff, is just the sheer clunkiness of what we got going now, just the sheer fat-fingeredness of the economic model we've got that wastes 40% of our food between fork and field. Part of it is just the sheer incompetence of our current system of management. Part of it also is what you've got is a mechanism now with advances in technology that can start to replicate what works. You've got the big, you've got the giantist, you've got these assumptions that there are cookie cutter templates that large development agencies can just roll out. And clearly that hasn't worked, and it's often had side effects. Then you've got the isolated small, which on its own isn't going to work as well. But I think what you've got also is the potential for well thought through, local, human focused things that just make stuff better on the ground. And they can be really simple. And I gave the example, it can be really simple stuff like the M-copper stuff with the D-light in it, which means you've got access suddenly to power. You don't have to buy the firewood. You don't get smoke inhalation. You don't have the healthcare costs and the absenteeism. Your kids, their exam pass rates go up in one study from 63 to 83%. You get access to the chance to banking systems. You can be saving money. You can make micropayments for the hand pump, which would again get you access to the underground water table, tripling the number of crops you can plant in one study, taking incomes up from 180 to 1800. There's this catalytic effect where a small technical intervention, even within a local system, can have a multiplier effect. But equally now, with the internet, what you're starting to see is the potential for some of these interventions to replicate, to disseminate rapidly, to spread, it's just exponentially bigger than it was. So I think there is this category, which is not just the small, not just the big, but the massive small, which is the stuff that works locally, that resonates. And because it resonates, it replicates. That's the stuff that gives me hope. There's all sorts of interesting stuff going on. So if you're looking at blockchain, that could be a massive liberation just in terms of simple stuff like wire transfers. That's a $437 billion a year market. But if you want to transfer $100 to Ghana, it's going to cost you about 11%, and it's going to take 2 weeks. Blockchain can make it essentially instantaneous for 1 to 2% instead. So there's all sorts of revolutions, let alone the crowd financing options that are happening, that could start just to make the job of producing locally, being self-sufficient, of course interdependent, but making your own stuff, producing your own stuff, and sharing in the value of what you've produced, rather than being an atomized part in someone else's supply chain. That's the revolution that's starting to become possible.